There's a particular kind of silence that falls over a narcissist's world in the days and weeks after an empath finally, truly leaves, not the performative silence they might display publicly, not the carefully curated indifference they show to anyone watching, but a private, disorienting quiet that catches them completely off guard, because for the first time and as long as they can remember, the one person who was always there to absorb, to explain, to soften, to manage, is simply gone. And today I want to walk you through exactly what happens inside a narcissist when this occurs. Not the story they'll tell other people about it, not the narrative they'll construct to protect their own image, but the actual psychological unraveling that takes place underneath the surface. Because understanding this can be profoundly clarifying for anyone who has ever wondered whether leaving mattered, whether it made a difference, whether the person they left behind ever truly understood what they lost. To understand what happens when an empath leaves, you first have to understand what that empath was actually providing, on a psychological level, for the entire duration of the relationship. This is something narcissists themselves often don't consciously recognize until it's gone, because they've never had to name it. They've simply relied on it, the way you rely on oxygen without ever thinking about the air you're breathing. An empath in a relationship with a narcissist typically becomes what psychologists sometimes call a regulatory external system. Someone who manages not just their own emotions, but the narcissist's emotional stability as well. They anticipate moods before they fully form. They smooth over insecurities before they become visible. They provide a steady, reliable source of admiration, attention, and emotional labor that the narcissist has never had to generate for themselves, because someone else was always generating it for them. And when that person leaves, the narcissist doesn't just lose a partner. They lose an entire regulatory system they never built the internal capacity to replace. The first thing that tends to happen in the immediate aftermath is something that looks from the outside like confidence, but is actually closer to disbelief wearing confidence as a mask. Narcissists are, almost by definition, poorly equipped to process rejection or loss in a straightforward way, because their sense of self has typically been organized around the assumption that they are the one who decides when relationships end, the one who holds the power to leave or stay, the one whose value is simply too high for someone to walk away from voluntarily. So when an empath leaves, genuinely leaves, not just threatens to, not just pulls back temporarily before being drawn back in through apology or charm, it creates a specific kind of cognitive dissonance that the narcissist's usual defenses aren't built to metabolize quickly. Their first response is often denial, dressed as dismissal. They'll be back. They can't actually manage without me. This is just a phase they're going through. This isn't necessarily conscious manipulation in this specific moment. It's often a genuine, if distorted, belief, because their entire self-concept has never had to accommodate the possibility that someone they'd been taking for granted could simply, permanently, stop showing up. The second phase, once denial starts to crack under the weight of continued absence, is usually a period of what looks like performance for an audience, even when there's technically no audience present. This is where a lot of the public behavior people notice comes from: the sudden burst of activity on social media, the new relationship that seems to appear with unusual speed, the visible effort to appear unaffected, thriving, better off. I want to be really specific about what's happening here psychologically, because it's often misread by people who've left, who see this performance and wonder if it means the narcissist genuinely doesn't care, genuinely wasn't affected. This performance isn't evidence of genuine indifference. It's evidence of exactly how threatening the alternative feels. Because for a narcissist, being seen as affected, as hurt, as genuinely destabilized by someone leaving represents a category of vulnerability their entire identity has been constructed to avoid at almost any cost. So instead of processing the loss authentically, they perform its opposite, sometimes so convincingly that they nearly believe it themselves, at least for a while. The third thing that happens, and this is where things get genuinely difficult for the narcissist, even though they'll rarely admit it to anyone, including themselves, is the gradual creeping realization that their sense of stability was never actually self-generated in the first place. This is often the first time in years, sometimes ever, that a narcissist is forced to sit with their own internal state without an external regulator managing it for them. And what surfaces in that space is frequently something they've spent their entire adult life avoiding: an underlying emptiness, an instability in their sense of self that the empath's constant attention, admiration, and management had been quietly, invisibly holding together. This isn't something that arrives all at once. It tends to arrive in fragments, in unguarded moments, lying awake at night with a kind of restlessness they can't quite name, feeling irritable or unsettled in situations that never used to bother them, noticing a hollow quality to interactions and achievements that used to feel satisfying. They typically won't identify this as grief, and they almost certainly won't identify it as loneliness in any form that resembles vulnerability. But it operates like both, underneath whatever explanation they construct to avoid calling it what it actually is. The fourth thing that happens, often running parallel to this internal instability, is what I'd call the search for replacement supply. The urgent, sometimes frantic effort to locate someone new who can step into the regulatory role the empath used to occupy. This is precisely why narcissists so often move into new relationships with a speed that seems almost inexplicable to people who've left them, because from the outside it looks like evidence that the previous relationship and the person in it never really mattered. But what's actually happening is closer to an urgent patch job, an attempt to fill the sudden void left behind by someone who had been managing emotional labor. The narcissist has no internal system for managing themselves. And this is worth understanding clearly, because it can be genuinely painful to witness from a distance. The speed of replacement isn't proof that you were interchangeable. It's proof of exactly how dependent they were on having someone, anyone, in that specific regulatory role, and how urgently they needed to fill it once it was gone. The fifth thing, and this one tends to surface later, once the initial performance and replacement seeking have run their course, is a specific recurring pattern of comparison that most narcissists never voice out loud, even to themselves in any conscious, articulated way. New partners, new friends, new colleagues. None of them quite manage the relationship the same way the empath did. And the narcissist, without necessarily understanding why, starts to notice friction in places that used to feel effortless. New people don't anticipate their moods the same way. New people push back more than they're used to. New people require the narcissist to actually manage some of the emotional labor themselves. Labor they'd outsourced for so long, they never developed the skill to do it independently. And this creates a strange, uncomfortable dissonance, a growing awareness, however unacknowledged, that something about the previous dynamic worked in a way these new dynamics don't quite replicate, even though acknowledging this directly would require admitting a level of dependency their self-image simply isn't built to tolerate. I want to pause here and address something important, because I think it often gets misunderstood in conversations about this topic. None of what we're describing means the narcissist is capable of the kind of reflective growth that leads to genuine change, and it's important not to romanticize this process as some kind of redemption arc waiting to happen. Most narcissists, even after experiencing this entire sequence, the denial, the performance, the internal instability, the frantic replacement seeking, the uncomfortable comparison, do not arrive at genuine self-awareness or lasting behavioral change. What typically happens instead is that the discomfort gets managed through external means rather than internal reflection. A new relationship that temporarily quiets the void, a narrative reconstruction where the empath becomes the villain of the story rather than the person who simply stopped absorbing what they shouldn't have had to absorb in the first place, a return to familiar patterns with new people who haven't yet learned what the empath eventually learned. Growth requires a level of internal accountability that the narcissistic defense structure is specifically organized to avoid, and one painful breakup, however destabilizing, rarely dismantles a defense structure that took an entire lifetime to construct. But here's what I think is genuinely important for anyone listening who has left a narcissistic relationship or who is trying to find the courage to leave one. The goal of understanding all of this was never to wait for their transformation, to hold out hope that your absence will finally teach them the lesson they needed to learn. to imagine some future moment where they show up at your door, having finally understood, having finally grown, having finally become capable of the reciprocity they were never able to offer while you were there. That fantasy, understandable as it is, keeps you tethered to an outcome that's largely outside your control and, more importantly, largely irrelevant to your own healing. Whether or not they ever change, whether or not they ever privately acknowledge what they lost, whether or not the empty space you left behind ever gets fully metabolized into genuine self-awareness, none of that determines whether your decision to leave was right. It was right the moment it protected you, regardless of what happens afterward in a story that, once you leave, is no longer actually yours to witness or manage. I also want to say something about the specific grief that comes with leaving someone like this, because it's rarely as simple as relief, even when leaving was unquestionably the right decision. You may find yourself missing someone whose absence you fought so hard to create, and that contradiction can feel confusing, even shameful, especially if people around you expect your relief to be uncomplicated. But grief doesn't require the person you're grieving to have been good for you. It simply requires that you invested something real, time, hope, love, a vision of a future. An investment like that doesn't disappear just because the relationship needed to end. You're allowed to grieve the relationship you hoped it would become, even while feeling certain that leaving the relationship it actually was the healthiest decision you've ever made for yourself. And so if you're the empath in this story, the one who finally left, the one who stopped absorbing, stopped managing, stopped regulating someone else's internal world at the expense of your own, I want you to understand something clearly, something that doesn't depend on ever knowing what actually happens on the other side of that silence. You were never responsible for holding someone else's sense of self together. That was never your job, even though you may have quietly believed it was for years without ever consciously deciding to take it on. And the discomfort they're likely experiencing right now, in whatever form it's taking, in whatever story they're telling themselves to avoid its full weight, that discomfort was never yours to prevent, manage, or fix. It's simply what happens when someone builds their entire internal stability on a foundation that wasn't actually theirs to depend on in the first place, and finally has to stand, for the first time in longer than either of you probably realized, entirely on their own. It's simply what happens when someone builds their entire internal stability on a foundation that wasn't actually theirs to depend on in the first place, and finally has to stand, for the first time in longer than either of you probably realized, entirely on their own. But I want to take this conversation further now, because understanding what happens to the narcissist in the immediate aftermath is only part of the story. What happens over the longer arc, months later, sometimes years later, reveals something even more important, both about the nature of this specific kind of psychological pattern and about what it actually means for the empath who walked away and is trying to make sense of a chapter that, from the outside, may look like it simply closed without consequence. Let's start with something that tends to confuse people who've left these relationships, something that can genuinely destabilize their own healing if they don't understand it clearly: the narcissist's apparent success in the months following the breakup. This is one of the most disorienting parts of watching someone you left continue to function, continue to attract new partners, continue to seem, from a distance, entirely unbothered, sometimes even thriving in ways that feel almost insulting, given what you know about what actually happened between you. I want to address this directly, because it matters enormously for anyone still working through the aftermath of a relationship like this. What you're witnessing when you observe apparent success from a distance is almost never the full picture, and it's rarely evidence of genuine internal peace. Narcissists are, generally speaking, extremely skilled at cultivating an external presentation that has very little correlation with their internal experience, precisely because that skill was often developed as a survival mechanism long before you ever entered their life. The confident, unaffected, thriving version of them that you see on social media or hear about through mutual friends or catch a glimpse of in public is frequently a performance maintained specifically because the alternative, visible vulnerability, visible loss, visible need, represents a threat to their entire identity structure that they will go to enormous lengths to avoid displaying, especially to anyone who might report back to you. This doesn't mean their suffering isn't real. It often is, in the ways we discussed. The hollow restlessness, the frantic replacement seeking, the uncomfortable friction in new relationships that never quite replicate the old dynamic. But real internal difficulty and visible external performance are not contradictory. They exist simultaneously, and the performance is often, ironically, most intense precisely when the internal difficulty is at its worst, because performing wellness becomes the primary coping mechanism for managing an internal state they have no other tools to regulate. This is worth understanding not because it should give you satisfaction. That's not really the point, but because it should free you from a comparison trap that keeps so many people stuck long after they've physically left. You are not failing at healing simply because their performance looks more polished than your process feels. You are simply doing something they are psychologically unequipped to do, actually processing what happened rather than merely managing its visibility. Now, I want to talk about something that happens over a longer timeline, something that reveals one of the more painful truths about this entire pattern, the way narcissists often eventually find a new person willing to occupy the same regulatory role the empath used to hold, and how, on the surface, this can look like proof that the narcissist simply moved on successfully, found someone new, continued their life without any lasting consequence at all. I want to complicate this picture, because it's rarely as simple as it appears. What typically happens is not that the narcissist finds someone equally capable, equally attuned, equally willing to absorb the same depth of emotional labor the previous empath provided. What typically happens is that they find someone who, for their own reasons, often rooted in their own unresolved history, is willing to step into a diminished version of that role. Someone who provides some of what was lost, but rarely all of it, and almost never with the same depth, because the empath who left was not simply performing a replaceable function. They were bringing an entire, specific, hard-won capacity for empathy that took years, sometimes an entire lifetime of their own history, to develop. And that capacity doesn't transfer neatly from one relationship to the next, especially not for the new partner walking in fresh, without yet having been worn down the way the previous relationship gradually wore down the person who finally left. This is why so many of these subsequent relationships, when you look closely, tend to be more volatile, more prone to conflict, more susceptible to the very dynamics the narcissist thought they'd successfully replaced. The new person hasn't yet learned the specific choreography the previous empath spent years learning: when to soften, when to absorb, when to manage. And so friction that used to be smoothed over invisibly starts to surface much more visibly, much more quickly. This doesn't mean the new relationship is destined to fail, and it doesn't mean the new partner is in any way less capable or less deserving of a healthy relationship. It simply means that the specific stability the narcissist experienced with the empath who left was not something inherent to narcissists generally receiving smooth, easy relationships. It was something specifically, painstakingly provided by someone who eventually reached the limit of what they were willing to keep providing. And that specific provision doesn't simply regenerate with anyone new who happens to walk through the door. I think it's important at this point in the conversation to address something that I know weighs on a lot of people who've left relationships like this: the question of whether the narcissist ever thinks about them, ever misses them, ever privately acknowledges, even just to themselves, what was actually lost. And I want to answer this honestly, without either falsely reassuring you or unnecessarily deepening a wound that's already difficult enough to carry. The honest answer is that it depends enormously on the specific person, on the severity of their patterns, on whether any capacity for genuine reflection exists underneath the defenses, which varies significantly from person to person, even within what gets broadly categorized as narcissistic behavior. Some do think about it in private, unguarded moments they'll never share with anyone, moments that surface briefly before being pushed back down by whatever defense mechanism handles uncomfortable self-awareness for them. Others genuinely don't, having successfully rewritten the story in their own mind so thoroughly that the version of events they now believe bears little resemblance to what you actually experienced together. But here's the thing I really want you to understand. Underneath all of this, it doesn't actually matter. Not in the way it might feel like it matters right now. Your healing was never supposed to depend on their private reflection. It was never supposed to require their acknowledgement, their guilt, their eventual understanding of what they lost. That expectation, however natural it feels, keeps you tied to their internal experience as the measure of whether your own experience was valid, and your experience was valid the moment you lived it, regardless of whether they ever privately confirm that to themselves. Let's talk now about what actually happens to you, the empath, in this same extended timeline, because I think this deserves at least as much attention as what happens to them, and it's often the part that gets least discussed, precisely because it's harder to observe from the outside, the way their visible performance is easy to observe. In the months following leaving, most empaths go through their own complicated sequence, not identical to the narcissist's sequence, but running on a kind of parallel track. There's often an initial period of profound disorientation, not unlike what we described happening to them because you too have lost a regulatory system, just a different kind. The system of constant vigilance, constant management, constant anticipation that had organized your entire nervous system for so long that its sudden absence creates its own kind of vertigo. You might find yourself in quiet moments, almost missing the intensity, the vigilance, the sense of purpose that came from managing someone else's emotional world, even while knowing, rationally, completely, that leaving was right. This isn't confusion about your decision. It's simply what happens when a nervous system that's been running one program for years has to slowly, sometimes painfully, learn an entirely new one. But here is where the story genuinely, meaningfully diverges between the two of you, and this divergence is really the entire point of everything we've discussed today. While the narcissist is largely incapable of using this disruption as an opportunity for growth, while their disorientation typically gets managed through performance, replacement, and narrative reconstruction rather than genuine reflection, you, the empath, actually have access to something they don't. You have the capacity for real reflection, real accountability, real change, because that capacity was never the thing that was missing in you. What was missing was permission to direct that same deep capacity for understanding inward toward yourself instead of exclusively outward toward managing everyone else's emotional experience at the expense of your own. And this is precisely what tends to happen, slowly, unevenly, but genuinely, in the months and years after an empath leaves a relationship like this. They don't just recover. They transform in ways the narcissist they left almost certainly won't, because they have the one thing required for transformation that the narcissist's defense structure is specifically built to avoid: the willingness to actually look honestly at what happened, at what they allowed, at what they're capable of building differently going forward. This is why if you're standing in the aftermath of a relationship like this right now, wondering whether any of it mattered, wondering whether leaving actually changed anything for either of you, I want you to reframe the question entirely. The measure of whether leaving mattered was never supposed to be located in them, in whether they suffer enough, learn enough, change enough to satisfy some sense of cosmic fairness about what they put you through. The measure was always supposed to be located in you, in whether you're slowly becoming someone capable of recognizing these patterns earlier, someone capable of extending the same fierce protection to your own well-being that you once extended so freely to theirs, someone capable of loving deeply without disappearing entirely into the process of loving. And if that transformation is happening, even slowly, even imperfectly, even on days when it doesn't feel like progress at all, then leaving already mattered entirely, completely, regardless of anything happening on the other side of a silence you may never fully witness the true weight of. So picture this, one last time, somewhere, in a life that continues without you, Someone is lying awake in the particular quiet that follows performance, in the space between the version of themselves they show the world and whatever version exists underneath it, feeling a hollowness they don't have the tools to name, reaching as they always have, for something or someone new, to fill a space that was never actually about filling at all. And somewhere else, in a life that continues without them, you are learning, slowly, sometimes painfully, sometimes with real joy. You didn't expect to feel again this soon, what it means to build stability from the inside, to offer your empathy as a gift rather than a reflex, to finally, fully belong to yourself. Two people moving in entirely different directions, shaped by the exact same relationship, and only one of them walking towards something real. Because that was always the quiet, cinematic truth underneath everything we've discussed today. Leaving didn't just remove you from someone who couldn't meet you. It returned you to yourself, fully, finally, standing in your own life, no longer waiting to be seen by someone who was never actually capable of looking.